program is brought to you by P. Murphy and Associates, successfully providing IT professionals to Southern California businesses.
Hi, this is Marlene Gibb with What Do You Do? And today's guest is Llewellyan Cox. And what do you do?
So I'm the CEO of Lab Launch. We are a nonprofit biotechnology incubator, and we recently opened our first location in Monrovia at Lab Launch Monrovia.
Right. So tell me, how would you define biotechnology? I want to get this straight in everybody's head.
Sure. So actually at Lab Launch, we take a very broad view of what we define as biotechnology. We view biotechnology as anything that uses the machinery of living things to achieve an outcome. So that can be anything from the production and creation of drugs and medical devices through to agriculture, or even some of the more exciting new things we're seeing in the field, such as synthetic biology and the replacement of chemical feedstocks with those derived from biological forms.
Okay. Explain that really in layman's terms.
So
the synthetics.
So the idea of synthetic biology is really, really very exciting.
Okay.
At the moment, not just our energy sector, but much of our manufacturing is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and specifically oil. In addition to products we all know and love, such as heavy oils, asphalt, and petroleum that we use as fuel. Crude oil provides many of the input chemicals that we use for every kind of manufacturing, be it the materials in your jacket
Right.
or the paint on the walls of your house. All these things come from chemicals that were originally derived by crude oil, which billions of years ago were made by living creatures and then buried under the ground for us to go and dig up later. Now, as well as obviously the environmental problems and the high cost of retrieving crude oil, we also have the problem that it's a limiting factor. And so it's very volatile in price.
And are we ever going to run out of it?
We certainly are.
Okay. I'm not just asking that because people say yes, no,
It's a difficult question, but the key is by kind of bypassing the burying things in the ground for 3 or 4 million years.
Right.
And using microorganisms such as bacteria or yeast to make some of these chemicals that we rely on, we can bypass that whole problem of drilling for oil, refining it, having waste products that are very environmentally damaging or very difficult to deal with, and making these products directly using living things. And that's a really very exciting angle that we're starting to see, even to the forms of the idea of constructing using living things, just like reefs are made naturally off the coast.
And so we would use a reef to do whatever we needed to do rather than digging in the ground?
Exactly. The idea is, if you needed a particular, chemical that was, the basic monomer for, a polymer that you make threads out of,
Okay.
then grow it in a bioreactor the same as we grow alcohol in a brewery reactor. Or in the case of, making a solid structure, literally using living creatures to construct that, just like as happens in a reef, only in a more controlled manner.
And let me make sure I get this. It's like we can get spiders can make silk.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're kind of talking about?
That is a very good example, actually, because recently a Chinese company was the first to use bioengineered microorganisms, forms of yeast, to actually make artificial silk that is biologically indistinguishable from spider silk. But it bypasses the need to use actual spiders, and it has it's a much more efficient and environmentally friendly way of doing these things without killing millions and millions of creatures. So that's actually an extremely good example. Another company that's coming out of our sister accelerator up in San Francisco is a company called Pembient. Their goal is to fight the rhino horn trade by creating rhino horn in a dish using microorganisms that will be indistinguishable from natural rhino horn. The idea is to flood the market with an indistinguishable product that's made in the laboratory, and thus decreases the financial incentives for people to take the risk of going poaching. So these are some of the things
wow.
that we're starting to see that people are really looking at some of the issues we have in our global supply chain and applying biological answers to them to solve some of the most pressing issues that we see ongoing. And certainly species loss and habitat destruction are big parts of that, and using biological means to overcome those problems.
What about the food? Where do you see the food going?
Food is another incredibly important part of biotechnology, and unfortunately scientists have both been a little bit behind the curve in talking to the public about what we need to do and what we can do, and what actually are the problems. We have at the moment a hugely expanding global population. There's
Right.
over 7 billion people on Earth now. It's not going to level off until we're at least around 11 billion. And frankly, knowing how well how good we are at controlling our own societies, probably many, many more. Those people will need to be fed. There's no getting around that. Unless we
Right.
want to resign ourselves to a future of mass starvation, we have to come up with solutions to be able to sustainably feed that many people. There simply isn't enough land on Earth to do that using current methods. Plus the fact that modern factory farming, especially in the animal area, is in itself incredibly environmentally damaging.
Right.
Not to mention the ethics of killing billions of sentient beings every year just to feed ourselves. So when we look at agriculture in the future, we need to be a lot more creative. We need to be able to grow more food on less land with less energy wasted. And so both in terms of crops, we're seeing a lot of real creativity in that area of helping crops grow in salt-damaged soils, help them grow in areas where they wouldn't naturally be able to grow, so we can increase our footprint of where we can grow crops.
Are they going to be heavily modified, some of these, because that comes out with the heavily modified food, the GMOs?
And this is a question that we need to get in front of, is this question of GMOs and the idea that they're somehow bad. It really couldn't be any further from the truth. It's just we've allowed a narrative to take place, and unfortunately it centers around companies like Monsanto, who I have no intention of defending, with some questionable business ethics that have kind of landed in us in this position. The overall goal of genetically modifying crops is to increase their productivity and make them more resistant to pests. And those are the things we absolutely have to do. Now, the questions come about because, for instance, certain companies have decided that because they sell pesticides, the best way to do this was to make their plant more resistant to pesticides and throw more pesticides on the land.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's not a sustainable solution.
No.
What we're seeing now is more nuanced ideas of making the plants themselves more resistant to pests.
Pets.
Your cat going and eating them. And things like that. Or a classic example that is slowly now getting past this problem is the concept of a product called golden rice. Now, this is a product that was actually developed without any commercial incentives. It was done on an open source basis between collaborating scientists from many, many different countries to solve the problem of widespread vitamin D deficiency in Southeast Asia. It's a very big problem. There's a lot of children grow up with developmental problems.
Really?
Because they have a massive shortage of vitamin D. They don't get much in their diet, and so they have these issues. So the idea was with golden rice, to insert a gene into a rice plant that would make it produce vitamin D. And this was done, like I say, by an international collaboration of academic scientists on an open source basis. There's no
Sounds
huge
like
patents or intellectual property that people need to get paid for years into the future for. And this product is ready, and it's been ready for about 5 years. But because we've been held back by this ongoing debate about GMOs, it hasn't been deployed. And when it has been deployed, Greenpeace and others have gone and ripped up the fields and destroyed them. So we still have millions of children with vitamin D deficiency. We have a solution that can work, but because we have these political issues, it's not reaching the market. And this is something as scientists we have to work very hard on. We have to explain to people why we're doing these things, and why they're essentially not really any different to how we've always done agriculture. Only instead of zapping plants with X-rays and horrible chemicals to see what they do on a kind of a really random basis and picking out the best ones, we're taking a much more targeted approach and looking at the genetic makeup and saying, this is the little tweak we can change how the plant just operates in itself to make one more product that will be nutritional, or to create something that will make them more resistant to pests, while keeping the rest of the plant, its nutritional value, its basic upkeep, essentially the same. And it's been shown in many, many studies now that actually the deployment of GM crops decreases the use of pesticides and fungicides and all these other chemicals that are really the thing that we should be worrying about putting into our bodies.
Right, exactly.
These chemical entities that we spray indiscriminately on fields. If we can use biology to overcome this kind of dependence on big chemistry, then that really should be our goal when we look at feeding a future world.
So what you're really dealing with is bioethical issues in some ways, right?
In some ways, yes.
Because, and I guess that gets into religious issues too. So you've got all the.
it can.
I think.
I don't know, actually. I've never thought about a religious take on it. I'm trying to think of how that would relate to people who have particular dietary, religious dietary restrictions. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's all together, because one seems to feed on the other. Whether it's true or not, sometimes those things just seem to
absolutely. This is the same with any new technology. Every new technology has always encountered resistance, and that's a natural part of human society, and it's quite normal. It's quite understandable. What is incumbent on the inventors of technologies is to develop them in a responsible manner, for the first part, but also to make sure that they're properly sold to the public in a way that they're understood and people can see why these things exist and how they can make their lives better. And that's frankly something we haven't done a great job of in biotechnology so far.
Well, I remember as a little girl growing up, and Roosevelt was president, and I was born in '44, but I remember how concerned my parents were about polio. That was a big concern of parents in the 40s and 50s. And so they came out with the polio vaccine, because there was one girl in my class that got polio. I remember this. And then now, polio is rearing its ugly head again. And it was almost wiped out. Mm-hmm. So I could never understand why people wouldn't do the polio vaccine if it's taking care of that problem. And, I don't. I mean, maybe because I remember how fearful parents were about it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting thing. That's how we get into a lot of what's happening now in our society, in the United States especially, is we are a generation that's grown up without the fear of diseases like polio and measles and all these terrible things that used to kill people. And deform them and maim them and do all kinds of terrible things. President Roosevelt himself was crippled by polio. The fact that we have an effective and safe way to stop that should be the end of the story. But as we found out, we're in this very kind of odd position now. We're in the post terrible illnesses society. So people don't viscerally experience the benefit of a vaccine. Being a parent, I've heard recently someone mentioned being a parent prior to 1950 was just terrifying.
It was. I was a little girl, but I remember my parents talking about it. It frightened them.
Exactly, and we've grown up, for a whole generation now without that fear. With this idea that your kids, if your kid gets sick, they're not going to drop dead in the morning. For the most part.
Right.
And so this creates almost an intellectual space for charlatans to step into, and just like snake oil salesmen always have, promise you that everything that's wrong with your life is because of some conspiracy by some big shadowy government or business organization, or it's because you're taking in some ill-defined toxin from your environment that's not making you happy or healthy, and spinning their own cures. And this is unfortunately what we saw with the vaccines, with a single doctor acting under a complete lack of ethics in London, doing pretty terrible things, taking blood from children at his kid's birthday party without any permission from their parents whatsoever, and then completely making up his own results to push a book and a product he was developing without declaring it with a different manufacturer. The downstream effects of that almost 20 years now have unfortunately led to the resurgence of measles, to a disease that can kill and maim little children.
Oh yeah. I had those too. I had measles and chickenpox, but I never had the mumps.
I never got mumps. I had chickenpox as a kid. I was just in that generation before the vaccine, so we went to chickenpox parties. Yeah. And I got shingles when I was in college, and that was even less fun.
Yeah.
But we're in a world where people don't really remember a lot of these things and how bad they can be.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to make a boogeyman out of the vaccine, that you have to go to the doctor and you're unhappy because you're 3 and they stick a needle in your arm and that makes you very unhappy. And you don't necessarily, as a parent, see the immediate benefit of that. And I think that creates a kind of a vacuum in people's understandings of how all these things fit together to create a healthy lifestyle.
Exactly. And I think the word biotechnology sometimes has all these weird things. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And the thing is,
the movie Blade Runner.
And this is the thing, there's a lot of language is the thing that always divides us. Mm-hmm. We were literally talking about this morning with the word biohacking that we've started to see appearing.
Now, what's that?
Now, this can mean one of two completely different things depending on who you are. It can mean, for instance, we have a group that's based in downtown Los Angeles, in a little community lab they built called LA Biohackers. And their goal is to teach the basics of, it's basically making a makerspace for biology. That's what they call biohacking, hacking the biology just like you hack code. Oh, okay. So the idea of, they'll help school kids or just interested citizens learn how you propagate plants, or how you would extract DNA from a strawberry just for fun, or how you might genetically manipulate a bacterium to make a particular chemical product. So these kind of things, and this is very exciting. These are things that people are starting to apply the machinery of biology to problems that previously have only been addressed with big industrial chemistry.
Right.
There's a completely another meaning of the word biohacking that's out there, which is the idea of modifying your own body with either biological or non-biological systems to improve it. And so these are two, there's a little bit of an overlap between these worlds, but they're very, very different ideas. And with this side of biohacking, it's kind of the self-improvement taken to the extreme.
Okay.
People creating their own implantable devices. There was a guy last year gave himself night vision by genetically modifying his own retina.
That's bizarre.
It's somewhat bizarre, but this is the strange new world we're actually moving into. The increasing knowledge of genetics and biology is really opening up both an entirely new world of understanding and obviously another world of possibilities.
Oh, exactly.
For instance, when I was in college, we were always taught that human beings see 3 colors, red, green, and blue. And every human being sees 3 colors, apart from people with color blindness who only see 2. It turns out a significant number of people actually see 4. And we never knew this.
What's the 4th?
It's a kind of a slightly more to the yellow side of green. So there's about 1% of the world population see everything as a combination of 4 colors or on the combination of 3 colors. And mathematics tells you that gives them an exponentially larger palette of colors that they can perceive, which is fascinating.
Yeah, that is.
The same is true of many of our senses. And so, so people are looking at how can we interface better with our brains, with our bodies, to not only repair problems where our bodies might be deficient. For instance, you're seeing such incredible advances with prosthetic arms and legs now. When even 20 years ago, they were just ugly appendages you bolted on to look normal. These days we have these incredible things that interface with the mind, or the brain itself rather, and can be moved and manipulated just like a natural, arm or leg would.
Wow.
Those kind of things are really kind of starting to take off, and that's really very exciting. But what we're kind of seeing from some of these somewhat fringe people, but a lot of fringe always ends up mainstream in the end, is the idea of taking these things beyond our natural capabilities and improving our bodies beyond where they could be naturally. Obviously, that's been happening in sport for 50 plus years, using chemical means, putting extra hormones or growth factors into people to give them better athletic performance. We're already starting to see that with mechanical and cybernetic systems. It's a really good question of when will a bionic limb be better than a human limb. I'm pretty convinced that's going to be very, very soon indeed.
There's an author I read, and I love my murder mysteries, and it's J.D. Robb, and she's under her real name is Nora Roberts, did romance, but this is set in 2058. And when I was reading the first book, I guess a hobo was sleeping, and they looked at him, and he was 115, and I thought, did I read that right? Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking, here it is, 2016, and that's going to be, the book's 2058, right? And it's not that big a leap of faith, of perception. Mm-hmm. It's not like 100 years from now. This is like 35, 40 years from now. I think all that's going to happen. Some of her stuff, I'm sure she's got researchers who have done a lot of this. Mm-hmm. It's amazing.
Absolutely, and again, I had this conversation over Christmas with my in-laws. There's an economic perspective to this as well. My in-laws, my own parents are in their 60s. Yeah. They're of what we would call normal retirement age. The time of life when back in the 1950s and 60s, it was determined that you should be leaving the workforce and retiring.
But they're not going to.
And they're going to live for another 40 years.
And economically, probably. And where are they going to, because Social Security is not going to be able to.
Exactly. We already have a population who thought they were reasonably going to live to 60, 70, and are quite often making it to 80 or 90.
The biggest growing population now is over 100.
Exactly, and we're now seeing the next generation who are coming up to normal retirement age now. I expect many of the boomers to make it to 90 to 110. By the time my generation is that old, I fully expect if I don't get a chronic, a really bad illness or hit by a car, I expect to see the 22nd century. And these things really do affect how we structure our society, how we provide services, and so you can't just look at them in a vacuum. You have to really take a big view at these things. But
well, biotechnology, getting back to you, is really, it's very inclusive. It's so holistic too. So why did you decide to do this? Why did you decide to launch?
That's a good story. I've always loved biology. It's always been my favorite subject. It never used to get the respect it deserves. We're thankfully now just moving past the point where biology is the science for people who can't do math.
Oh, really?
But I always found biology most exciting in my life. I had no real life plan as a school kid. I went to college to study the major I found most interesting, which was, in my case, cell biology and molecular biology. It led me almost organically into a PhD, which was really cool. I had some really good research. And after moving to the States and working as a researcher for a few years here, I gradually started to transition out of kind of doing my own research at a university into entrepreneurship. And so over the last 7-8 years in Los Angeles, I've kind of been experiencing both being a founder of startup biotechnology and also consulting with other people who were starting biotech companies. And it became very clear to me that although we have incredible talent in the Los Angeles area, as a region, we produce more more graduates in biotechnical disciplines than any other city in America, by a long way.
Really? So USC?
Between USC, UCLA, Caltech, or the Cal States, all the 120 colleges in Los Angeles County. Between them, we produce nearly 6,000 graduates in biotechnical
Expertise?
biology-related degrees every year. The next city is like San Francisco, Boston. It's around 3,500. We are so far ahead. We have this incredible talent base, and yet not that many companies actually start here. And this was what I started to see very viscerally in my own experience. Even companies being spun out of USC, UCLA with really, really cool technology that's been developed and researched in Los Angeles were moving to San Francisco or San Diego to start their businesses. And so we kind of came together as a group, myself and my co-founders, and said, why is this? What is causing people to leave town? And the number one reason was a lack of accessible space. There simply was just a complete dearth of lab space where you could move after your work in the university to establish your own company, get some research and development done to produce your first prototype product that you could then shop to early stage investors. Really, there was only one functional incubator facility in all of Los Angeles County in Pasadena.
Wow.
And frankly, they're always full because the supply is massively outstripped by the demand. And so the first thing that we decided to do was to found ourselves, Lab Launch, as a nonprofit.
Which is unusual. That's another usual.
I get a lot of questions about it, but we're very pleased with our decision to go the nonprofit route.
Can I ask you something while you're sharing your story?
Mm-hmm.
Did you, because you liked biology, I mean, you liked the field, and then you moved it into the entrepreneurship, you kind of blended this whole thing of who you are. I mean, no, because you didn't go the traditional path. You went the entrepreneurship, and then you went in even further, working within a nonprofit environment, which can be a pain sometimes. Mm-hmm. So I just find you fascinating in that realm.
I think I'm a product of my life experience, like everyone else probably is, to be fair.
Well, we all are, but you managed to make it yours. You didn't make it somebody else's.
It's weird, I mean, I remember being young and having ideas about where my life was going to go and what I was going to do. And at every stage, things have worked out in a completely different and much more interesting direction than I ever thought possible. And I've been very, very lucky in my life.
Can you figure out why? Or did you just leave yourself open to it?
I can't honestly answer that. It's just, like I say, I'm a product of my own experience. I think that, it's interesting. I've always been pulled in odd directions, and I think I've become used to it. So it's not alien for me to think about doing something a little bit different, a little bit not the common path. I like to joke that my life is basically Harry Potter without the magic and wonder.
I think it is with Harry Potter.
I grew up in a pretty working class environment. My father is a railway engineer, or retired railway engineer now. My mom was a stay-at-home mom when I was a child. She's now a prison chaplain. So I didn't come from any great wealth, and I was in an environment growing up in state schools where I wasn't in a greatest learning environment due to a number of factors, like my school being arsoned. At the age of 10, I was in a class of 60 students.
God.
And struggling in some areas. And a series of chance events happened in an incredibly short space of time where suddenly I found myself at the second oldest school in the world on a scholarship among kids of captains of industry and international magnates and people who rule the world. And that, like I say, it's like Harry Potter without the magic and wonder. And that was a weird experience for me. And so I think that and many things that, this process seems to repeat. Every time I think I know where things are going, something happens and a path opens up and
But you go through the
you
door.
walk down it. It's,
But some people say, I'm not going down that door. You go down the door. I go through the door.
That's just, I guess that's just the kind of kid I am, and it's the kind of, if you see something interesting, you grab at it and you look at it,
Well, yeah, and I was thinking, I thought, you've got the entrepreneurial background too. I thought maybe he just likes seeing all these companies springing up from where they come from within your
that's
incubator.
The greatest thing about my job. I mean, I love doing research. I wish I had time and money to do more of my own original work. I love starting companies. Lord, it's hard, but it's fun. And I'm always keen to share the idea. The entrepreneurial experience it is frightening and scary, but it should never be beyond the reach of anyone. Certainly not in America in 2016.
Right.
And that's very important to me. But this is the real exciting thing about what I do for a living now, because we run Lab Launch Monrovia, and we've created the space for people to come and set up their own companies. And
How many possible companies can you have in that facility?
So our facility in Monrovia can house up to about 20.
Oh, okay.
So we have 6 in residence already. We've been open 3 months, so
Wow,
we're
that's
pretty
too
pleased
many.
with our rate
Yeah.
of bringing people on board. And that's the thing, we built this facility thinking, we might have a couple of guys want to work on, new drugs, or kind of antibodies, those kind of next-gen treatments, and we might have some people in like delivery systems, targeted particles to take drugs to organs or tumors without tainting the rest of your body or whatever. And our experience now is as we now are open up and taking in companies, it's mind-blowing when you talk to some of these people what they're trying to do. And you're like, I never thought that was even a thing.
Like what? Like what? What?
So just as a brief thing, we have one company, Drywired. They make coatings for biological implants. So, if you see someone who's had a pacemaker heart pacemaker for 20, 25 years, it comes time when you have to go in and change the battery. They mineralize, they get a bit crusty, they're not good looking, and that in turn can, make your immune system a little unhappy. And so, to make these things more tolerable to your body, these guys have created, coatings for these things that make them more tolerable to your body. It's fascinating. We have a company called Valley Nanomedical. Actually, they just moved all their stuff in yesterday. They're creating a really exciting nanoparticle that not only can zoom in right on a tumor and take drugs there, but it could also deliver both drugs that really, really hate liquid water environments together with drugs that really, really like liquid water environments to the same tumor at the same time. So it's essentially not only targeting drugs to the tumor rather than just flooding your body with it, it's co-delivering 2 drugs that have different effects, which will have a much bigger combined effect in knocking down the problem that's happening in the tumor. We have another company that's working on creating new diagnostics for performance-enhancing drugs. It's obviously a huge problem in athletics, and what happens is, and we've always seen this, is that international athletes will start cheating.
Yeah.
And then these new entity chemicals, hormones, whatever, filter their way down into gyms and into kind of the bodybuilding and health and fitness community, and then they end up in the workplace, and then you have problems. You certainly don't want soldiers or firemen taking amphetamines. No. And so what Corva Labs, these guys do, headed by a guy called Paul Scott, who's famous as the guy who caught Lance Armstrong, what they do is they're leading the arms race from the defense side of things. They get a phone call from U.S. Athletics, U.S. Olympic Committee, someone like that, and say, hey, something's going on here. These guys are getting too good too quick. So they first find out what they're doing, and then have to create a diagnostic test so that you can screen everybody to make sure no one's doing it. And
How interesting. That's, wow.
it's a fascinating process.
So they know with the athletes, even the nuances, if they're moving up a little too quickly.
That's and it's really interesting to talk to Paul actually about the state of international drug testing.
I should
and,
ask. I should have him on.
You should interview him. He's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Most of our chemical tests are terrible. We're so far behind the cheats that we don't catch them by chemistry. Most people who fail blood tests for performance enhancing drugs fail because they've taken a supplement that's been contaminated with something that shows up positive on a screen. The way that we usually catch people cheating is when we look at their performances. And while, say, just in a 100-meter sprint, we know that the fastest guy who's ever run that ever in history at this point is something like 9.7 something seconds. Now, we might not necessarily know where the top end of that performance is. Maybe it'll come down with conditioning and all the other things that make us healthier generation after generation. Maybe it'll come down to around the 9-second mark. We don't know where the top end is. But under normal training circumstances, without chemical assistance, there's a limit at how much better you can get, how quickly.
Right.
You know, you can maybe you'll get to here, maybe you'll get to here, maybe you get to here. But how quickly you improve is really limited. And so when people start breaking above this slope, they get too good too fast. That's when you start to ask, is something going on here? They put on too much mass too quickly. Is there something going on here? You know, there's very well understood now. People have been looking at athletics, measuring everything about athletes and other folks like astronauts, other professions where people are constantly monitored for decades now. And so the field of human performance metrics is very, very well understood. And so it's usually mathematics that catches these guys. That's really what led to Lance Armstrong being widely suspected, was just the mathematics of it just didn't add up for the performances he was putting in. And as we've seen, he was really brought down in the end by a whistleblower. And we've seen this time and again, Balco, the cycling scandal. They've essentially been brought down by a whistleblower who came out and said, this is what they're doing. And then someone like Paul from Corva Labs can go, that's what you're doing. I'll work out a way to test for that. So we're really playing catch up on defense in this kind of field of international doping. So it itself is a fascinating field, and it
He must love it. I mean,
he does. He's an amazing guy, and he's a wonderful speaker as well. But the whole thing is though that this in turn, these things don't exist in a vacuum. This can really inform other aspects of human physiology and drug development and healthy living in a kind of a circular fashion. The more we look into these issues of hyper-performance and we see some of the downsides of some things, you can learn about the biology of what's going on from that. You're like, we're stimulating this as well as diminishing this, and that's causing this problem, but actually this problem happens in a disease. So maybe if we do something different there. So it's
a lot of out-of-the-box thinking too.
It is, and that I think is the big difference between an entrepreneurial environment and an academic research environment.
Now, in an academic research environment, what would they do? Keep continuing researching it, or what?
Yes, and it's because of the way funding works. It's very narrowly tailored. So, for instance, I might be a postdoctoral researcher, and I work for prestigious Dr. X in his lab, and we're investigating colon cancer. And we have a big grant from the National Institutes of Health to look at colon cancer. So I'll be doing some research in his lab, maybe into some cells that mimic the disease or something. If I find something completely unrelated to colon cancer, there's no funding to pursue that. I have to stay focused on pursuing
But
what
maybe
my lab is trying to pursue under our grant to study colon cancer. So there's a lot of, and it's because of the way our funding system works in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of balkanization of research. People live in their own little areas, and there's not, certainly in academia, there's not much crossover.
There's no fluidity. Well, when my husband was real ill with esophageal cancer, which is rare, it was, and it wasn't, and he was a non-smoker. So anyway, there are maybe 6 or 7 main cancer centers in Southern California. Do you know they don't know each other?
It wouldn't surprise me.
That's what they say, because the money. Now I learned this the hard way, and I'm sure I'm going to get nailed on this. If you're in one, and this was 17 years ago, so we had Blue Cross, and that was all PPO. They didn't want that money to leave their hospital for another hospital that maybe could have worked with that better, or they won't divulge information to each other's hospitals. That to me was just horrible, because people's lives are at stake here, and some information from another hospital that they don't have this information, they won't share it.
Absolutely, and this is a huge issue of debate among the academic and the medical research communities right now, especially with respect to the data aspect of things. And I think things are changing for the better. There's amongst scientists, there's a huge groundswell of support to make data more accessible.
I mean, why are you doing the same thing when you can just combine it and you could take that and do something else? I was very, very angry when I heard that. I was very hurt. I was very angry, and I thought, this isn't helping him. It's not helping other people.
Absolutely, and that's the experience that that a lot of patients and frankly a lot of doctors go through. And this is where we're seeing, I think, a bit of a culture change, because it's really a lot of the doctors and the research scientists are really starting to push on national regulators like the National Institutes of Health, like the National Science Foundation, to make sure that at least research data is openly accessible. The concept that if the government pays for this research, the outcomes of this research should be publicly available. That's a principle that more and more scientists, more and more doctors are getting behind. And thankfully, in the last few years, certainly the NSF and the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, a little bit behind, but they're getting there as well. They're starting to implement policies to make sure that data from clinical trials, from preclinical experiments, is made available to other scientists, to other doctors, after the study is done. Because this is the history of science. We never know where it doesn't work when you're like, this is my thing and I love it and I'm the expert, which helps you to maintain a prestigious expertise level, right. But it doesn't improve the overall condition. And the history of all science, whether it's physics, chemistry, biology, is that things never go in the direction you think they're going to go. And most of the great innovators of history have seen something that someone else discovered and taken it in a completely different direction and made something work out of it. Right.
Is that what you do? Is that what some of your incubators do?
I think so.
That's absolutely fascinating to me, that their incubators, their startups, they say, like what you're talking about, we're going to do this, and then something else happens and they're in a different direction. And
this is actually one of the interesting, and it's why things like incubators and accelerators are very, very helpful. Because
explain incubators, because I don't think, because when we think of incubators, we think of little babies.
That's how I think of an incubator. It's a little baby lives in there. So, and that's exactly the purpose of an incubator. It's to provide life support to a young company who hasn't got what they need to stand on their own yet. Right. This is my definition of incubator.
Okay,
these are fungible words that people throw around. But that's our goal.
You can envision a little. So, and you're sharing at your place.
Absolutely, yes. So the idea is, for instance, a group of postdoctoral researchers and students from one of our local institutions say that they think of a really cool idea, and they want to make a business out of it. They're like, this product would be both awesomely useful and saleable, and we can make that into a business. But to start up your own lab from scratch, to go out and find a 2,000-3,000 square foot space that you can build a laboratory in, and then build a laboratory, buy all of the equipment that you have to make it work, you could easily be on the hook for $500,000 plus.
And
that's prohibitive. No one has that kind of cash.
Right. And then you haven't even hired employees.
At a very early stage, especially if you don't have some kind of grant to support this work, and grants don't build companies, that's just prohibitive. Our goal is, so we've essentially taken the concept of a co-working space. You see many of these office spaces where you have low-cost, desk and mailbox service to help you get up and running. We've taken that model and expanded it to laboratories. So these people can now move into our lab, rent one bench in a big shared room, where we provide fridges, freezers, safety, hoods, all of the big infrastructure stuff that you need on a shared basis. Because honestly, a freezer, you put your stuff in and close the door. You don't care who else's stuff is in the other shelves.
Do they share well?
People have to.
Okay.
They can share well, or they can build their own lab for $500,000. And that's the thing.
It's forced sharing.
But at the same time, it creates a collaborative environment, and having a range of people doing different things in their labs negates the perceived worry about someone scooping your work or stealing your work, which never really happens in real life anyway.
Really?
No. We tell a joke that there's the difference between a scientist who hasn't founded a company and a scientist who has founded a company. The ones who haven't founded a company are worried people are going to steal their ideas. People who have founded a company are worried how the next person they tell their idea is going to shoot it down. Because that's really the experience most of us with startup companies, especially in high-tech, advanced tech fields, find is you tell someone about your idea and go, oh, this is great, and it can cure this kind of cancer, and it's going to be groundbreaking, and people are like, nah, it's not going to work. It's a stupid idea. That's the real experience of telling most people your ideas, especially again in very advanced sectors. Most of these ideas do sound fanciful. The idea 10 years ago, someone said, if someone had told you, oh, we're going to have self-driving cars, that you'll press a button on your phone, and the car will just turn up and take you where you want to go.
No, I don't know.
That was fanciful. That was insane. But now it's very, very nearly a possibility. And this is, it's.
That'd be nice.
It's happening. We have bets right now of when manually driven cars are going to be illegal. I have sometime in the 2030s.
Yeah, see, it's like the book in the book, that murder mystery, she shoots up vertically too.
Oh, that's fun.
It's just not horizontal. This is New York, so congestion shoots up vertically and drives that way and then comes down.
We're already starting to see this with the way that drones are working. We've essentially been two-dimensional species for thousands of years. For the most part, we've existed on a flat surface with some bumps. And at the very, very best, we climb in a big metal tube, and we fly in a straight line a couple of thousand feet above this flat surface to get from one point on the flat surface to another point on the flat surface. And I think this is one of the key things we're seeing changing in the 21st century, that kind of third dimension is becoming real to us. The idea of going up as well as sideways is so much more of a normal experience. And as we look more towards some of the more fanciful, but I believe realistic things people are doing in the space sector, with the growing private sector in space with SpaceX and all these other companies, off-world is inherently three-dimensional.
Oh yeah.
So I think that that's a fundamental change we're seeing in how we operate as human beings, and I don't know how it's going to end up, but it's fascinating to watch the process unfold.
So you can even get people like that into. It doesn't make any difference in your incubator. You seem to be pretty open.
We're very agnostic.
Okay.
I mean, we are focused on biotechnology.
Right.
We obviously, our expertise is in biotechnology, so we can do a better job, I think, for biotech-focused companies to make connections they need and get set up with the right expert advisors and partners that they're going to need. We might not have quite so much of that expertise in other areas, but if someone just needs a space to come and start a company, that's what we exist for. You know, we're a clean, controlled environment, you know, where people can come and work and get their ideas off the ground.
That's very good. We're going to finish up, but I like your quote, so I'm going to read it to you so that you forgot that you said it, right?
I hate reading my own writing.
I'm quoting it, right? So, okay. What advice would you give someone starting your particular business? That's my question. Ignore everything you learned in school. Entrepreneurship can't be learned from a book. It's a process that you can prepare for, but need to be flexible, creative, resilient every day to make it work.
I hate reading my own writing.
Well,
but
this conversation is all about that.
You know, it's one of the most common questions I get asked. Certainly when I go and speak to groups of students who are in graduate level or in postdoctoral students, and quite often they'll ask me, what book should I read about starting a business? I'm interested in biotech entrepreneurship. What book should I read? I usually give them a very sarcastic answer. One fish, two fish, or something. I'm a very big fan of the I Learned Everything I Need to Know in Kindergarten.
That's a wonderful book. Do you want to explain
but, the idea is, you know, I mean, and it's a cultural difference, you know, when you're in the learning environment in college and that, it's all about knowledge acquisition and an application to an extent. Whereas running a business, you know, there's obviously, especially in our sector, there is that technical side of things to build your product. But the main part of deciding whether you're going to be successful or not successful is how you do business and how you form partnerships and how you deal with your suppliers and your partners and all of the many, many people you have to interact with on a day-to-day basis, how well you network, how well you can communicate with other people in your sector, how you can do deals. And you know, these are social skills. These aren't things you can learn from a book. These are things you have to learn by experience. And that, you know, it sucks. I wish I could tell kids, like, go read this book and everything will be fantastic. I wish I could do that, but I simply can't. And I've certainly, from my experience, had to learn a lot of these things the hard way. Networking and sociability is not something that comes naturally to me.
What did you do? I mean, how did you do this? Since, you know, years ago I went to Caltech, and they used to have an entrepreneurship for, you know, people in the computers and all. And there was a man who was presenting his idea. I can't even remember what the idea was, but they always had an accounting person, a lawyer. You know, they had all the right people to have around you. And he wanted to market the business. He was the president. And all of them said to him, you cannot market your own business. He says, but it's my business. They said, you do not have the personality to sell it. Mm-hmm. And he was just so highly offended because it was his incubator, his baby. But he didn't have the personality, and he didn't want to hear what other people were telling him.
No, and that's another key thing. You know, and I think it's harder the more educated you are. You have to be incredibly humble about starting a business.
Right.
And understand that the vast majority of the time you fail, and you will continue to fail. And failure is a very normal part of life. And that's very, very hard for people who've always been high achievers to learn. You know, we grow up in the society where you work hard at school, you get the good test scores, you go to the top college, you're going to be great, right? That's it.
Then you hit
real life.
And you hit rock bottom.
And you realize that, you know, even if you're in, I did a thing at a school group recently, we were talking about sales. And I was explaining the concept of we're talking about failure, and I explained the concept of conversion rate to them. You know, the basic idea of, for the number of people you try and sell something to the number you actually execute and sell it to. And if you're in a sales position, 5% conversion rate is generally considered superstar.
Right.
19 times out of 20 you're failing. That is a very hard thing to get used to for people who have never failed at anything in their life. There's also an aspect of resilience. Again, if you're lucky enough to have had an upbringing where things have been relatively easy for you, and you know you've taken the right steps and you've gone to the right places and met the right people, learning to be resilient, learning to get slapped down and get back up is actually a hard thing to do. I'm
glad you're talking about this because I think it's such an important topic. Failure too is very important. It's very important in the personal growth process. It's not. I think there's a lot of shame around the word failure. I think that's the big word, shame. And there's no shame, but yet our society puts a lot of shame around it.
And this is the thing, you know. I mean, if you can. I will never argue that Silicon Valley is a healthy, responsible environment. But if you look at the culture around Silicon Valley and how tech entrepreneurs are encouraged to fail quick, fail cheap, learn something from it, and move on to the next one. That is the scientific process. That is what we should be doing as both scientists and as entrepreneurs. Get to the next decision point as quickly and as affordably as possible. Yes, no decision. Yes, move forward. No, kill it and stop wasting everyone's time and money. Move on to the next thing. And there's no shame in that whatsoever. And it is a cultural thing we need to get over.
Yeah.
But there's a certain level of resilience there as well. You know, just things going wrong, you know, running out of money, not being able to pay suppliers who you owe money to, all the terrible things that happen to you as a young businessman. You know, these things, you develop a sense of resilience. And I think it's very interesting when I was recently watching a panel with some very famous investors, and they started talking about why are such a large number of successful entrepreneurs in America immigrants? And I think this is a very big part of it, because when you grow up outside of the United States and all of the benefits and stability and safety and opportunities that this country provides, you grow up a little harder. You grow up a little more streetwise. You learn to deal with things not being perfect, things not going well.
There's no such thing as perfection.
And I think that's the thing as well. You know, when you take that experience, that attitude to being, you know, a business owner, it serves you very, very well. That it's like, oh, yeah, we've got 3 bills and only enough money to pay 2 of them. Well, that was every day of my life. You know, so my mom and dad would sit around saying, oh, we pay the water last because that's the last thing to get cut off.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and the gas. Which of the 2 now are?
Yeah, which do we need most this month, electricity or gas? That's frankly quite normal for people who grow up outside of a very privileged sector of American society. Even folks actually, frankly, from non-privileged backgrounds in the U.S., which again I think is a huge reservoir of untapped potential. It's amazing to me when I speak to young people and students from less privileged backgrounds, how just the concept of running your own business, of being your own boss, is almost alien. Beyond maybe the concept of having one little store and running it. Maybe I'll run a Subway. There's nothing wrong with running Subway.
Right.
But that's the very limit of entrepreneurship that I think anyone from probably a majority of the country is ever really exposed to. Just the concept that you have a great idea, you go out, you make it into a product, and you sell it, and you can be your own boss. You can be successful, and you can make something that makes other people's lives better. That to me is an incredibly empowering and uplifting thing. And I think it's really, really important that we really focus on young people and make it really clear to them that this frankly is what made America what it is. And that's how you're going to make it even better. You don't need to be just a cog in a machine. You need to learn a skill so you can go and work for the man and make him a lot of money.
Right.
You know, you can be an entrepreneur. You can start a business, and you can take it upon yourself to make your community, your state, your country a better place. And I think that's incredibly uplifting message that we need to communicate better. You know, a lot of the conversations about these things, about starting businesses, small businesses, entrepreneurship, that, you know, at the political level, there are these very, you know, 10,000-foot top-down ideas of, you know, they get into macroeconomic issues. But how do we help that one kid in 10th grade think, I could do this. I like engineering. I could make a company that makes something that helps people's lives be better. I could make this product. I could be the next Steve Jobs. Yeah, it's trying to communicate that on an individual basis to young people who still have everything ahead of them, have all the time in the world to fail. Right. And this is the key as well. Get them started young.
And so you're doing that. You know, my feeling is, listening to you for the last, I don't know how long we've been talking, that you're so concerned, you want the kids to stay, you want people to stay within their areas where they grew up. A lot of people want to stay in Southern California, right? They do. The ones who go to school here and want to stay here. And then you talk to young people here. There are a lot of young people in Southern California who would love to have a biotech business or start something.
Exactly, and it shouldn't.
You have a big.
It's never going to be easy,
mission.
But it shouldn't be as hard as it is.
No, you have a good mission. You really do.
Thank you. But this is really, really important for me and for society in general. Is the idea that, but you say most people do stay where they're born, just like companies. People tend, for the most part, tend to grow up and live where they're from. And the only exception to that is the occasional person who decides to wander off and go on a journey, or in a bad situation where you're almost forced to leave. And the same is true of people in businesses. Right. But so you can imagine, we've got like 250,000 kids in education at any one time, I think, in Los Angeles. They're all going to grow up and live here.
Right.
What kind of world are we going to help them build? Because they're the ones who are going to build that world. It's not going to be us. No. We're the old folks. We're just going to stand around and crow from the sidelines. Do we want these kids to grow up with ambitions that are limited to working for someone else and bringing home a decent paycheck and
working for the man and not making any money,
being a good member of society and just about scraping by? Or do we want to tell them that, give them a sense that you can do this? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be darn hard, and it's going to hurt. It's going to strip your soul to its very bare roots. But if you believe in yourself and you believe in what you're doing, eventually you'll make it. And then you can create real value for your community. You can create real jobs in your community. You can be the guy employing other people. You can. I think this is really, really important.
I think it's important. It's important. I think you're doing important work, and I'm really glad I had a chance to talk to you about all this.
Thank you.
I want you to close up.
Okay. I'm Llewellyan Cox. I'm the CEO of Lab Launch. You can reach us at team@lablaunch.org or check out our website at lablaunch.org.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Anytime. It was fun.
It was lots of fun. This is Marlene Gibb with What Do You Do?